And it's a great pleasure to have here with us today Professor Daniel Katz. Daniel, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hello, Daniel. And where are you physically at? What city are you coming from?
I'm in Irvine, California, where it's 5:30 in the morning.
Oh, well, good morning, sir. I hope you have your coffee next to you.
Yeah, and hopefully my hotel internet will keep working.
Okay, we'll keep our fingers crossed. Good, I'll get right to it then. Just a quick introduction and then you can begin. Your topic today will be the overlap between FAIR for research, software, and open science. And I wanted to just give a quick introduction about yourself. Daniel is Chief Scientist at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, also known as the NCSA, and a Research Associate Professor in Computer Science, Electrical, and Computer Engineering, and the School of Information Sciences, iSchool, at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His interests in the development and use of advanced cyber infrastructure to solve challenging problems at multiple scales. His technical research interests are in applications, algorithms, fault tolerance, and programming in parallel and distributed computing, including HPC, grid, and cloud, to name a few. Daniel is also the current Associated Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Open Source Software, and today he will discuss the role of software in research, the FAIR, which stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable for research software principles, the community that developed them, the next steps in their implementation, and the systematic challenges that need to be addressed for software to be more fair and for it to be help meet humanity's science goals. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to welcome to you from California early in the morning, Professor Daniel S. Katz. And the stage is yours, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, it's unfortunate I can't actually see the audience, and because I'd like to ask how many people are familiar with FAIR for data, or FAIR more generally. But I'm going to assume that that the idea of FAIR is kind of known, and try to talk about it a bit. So just to start off then, why do we actually care about research software? I'm going to take a slightly US-centric view and look at funding. And about 20% of the projects funded by the National Science Foundation, which is the main academic science funder in the US, over 11 years, topically discussed software in their abstracts, and that's about $10 billion of funding. The Department of Energy has a project called the Exascale Computing Project, and it's spending about $4 billion on research software over a 4 or 5, 6 year period. We can look at publications, and we can see that software-intensive projects are a majority of current publications across science. The most cited papers are either method papers or software papers generally. And we can also ask researchers. And when we've done this, we've found that over 90% of US and UK researchers use research software. 65% wouldn't be able to do their research without it. And about 50% develop software as part of their research. So assuming that the research software is important, we can think about a vision for where research software should be in the world of science and engineering and scholarship more broadly. And that's that all research software that can be is open. All research software is high quality and robust. It's all findable, accessible, usable, and used by others for their own research, and it's cited when it's used. All contributors to research software are recognized for their work, and they have good careers within their institution. All research software is sustained as long as it's useful, and all research is reproducible. And these things have some common pieces. They overlap in terms of incentives and policies, and they all really start with the recognition of research software and its importance. But there's different groups that work on different pieces of this. So we have the open science community in general. We have the software engineering community. We have the FAIR community. We have the software citation community and journals like the Journal of Open Source Software. We have the research software engineer community, or RSE community. We have software sustainability institutes in the UK, a Proto Institute in the US, and one in Australia starting up. And then we have a big reproducibility group. And so I'm just going to talk about these two kind of red parts here, not the other parts, but there could be equally interesting talks, hopefully, on any of these topics. So if we think about open science, I want to kind of frame open science as starting with a collaboration idea. And it's the free sharing of scientific ideas, methods, and results. It's not just science, right? Science in US English and British English has this more limited idea, and wissenschaft is a more general term that maybe we should be using, which kind of in English seems to translate to knowledge or scholarship or something that's beyond science. And so this collaboration was initially done through handwritten letters and books and was mostly aimed at other scientists. And then it more frequently happened, and it was happening via printed journals starting, I don't know, 400 years ago roughly, and expanded the audience of people that could be involved. The digitalization expanded opportunities for sharing as well as what could be shared, kind of bringing in the public potentially. And this kind of democratization of research with public funding of research and information sharing through the web and bulletin board systems really expanded the community. And so this is all in some ways based on this idea of knowledge as a common societal good. It's interesting that as far as I can tell, and I haven't done a huge amount of research, this idea of open science seems to have come from this paper by Shunturk in 2001, which has this nice saying: in this paper, I introduce a new concept, open science, to denote a pluralistic and democratic science culture. And so even though this concept is quite old in some ways, the term appears to be more new. On the other hand, we have competition, and we have the fact that, as the previous speaker was mentioning, we live in a capitalistic world. And because of that, we have economics that really drives our lives and our careers. It drives where we work in terms of who's hiring and how we're hired and where we choose. It drives how we support ourselves, how we get promoted, how we get salaries, how we get funding to actually do science. And that's partly based on actually support of funding agencies, of institutions, as well as of recognition of our work that leads to that support. Which science we actually do, which tends to fall into the areas that we think will lead to reward, and which students we train or take advantage of, depending on your viewpoint. And so there's a definition of economics as the science of allocating scarce resources to maximize the achievement of competing ends. But sometimes this is a false argument in the world of research, because some resources can be increased without cost in some sense, and digital resources fall into this. So we can also look at why not open science, why people don't actually share what they're doing. And then there's a few different reasons. Sharing takes effort, and the immediate benefits of sharing go to others, not to the person that's actually making the effort. The mechanisms of sharing are new for a lot of people, and they're not the way work has traditionally been done. Metrics for evaluating products that can be shared are undeveloped, and so we don't necessarily get rewarded for actually doing the sharing because we don't have the right metrics to measure it. Intellectual property laws, again, going back to the previous speaker, can harm sharing. Commercial entities can profit from restricting access to material, even if there's no cost actually to sharing that material. And we also have nonprofit scientific societies that are often dependent on journal subscription fees, either to support themselves or to support the work they do. And so even these groups may be against open sharing in many cases. So human behavior then kind of balances this idea of competition and collaboration often. And if we're thinking about engagement in research, engagement in software, we can define engagement as meaningful and valuable actions that produce a measurable result. And we can think of this engagement as basically motivation, right? It's motivation that could be intrinsic, could be extrinsic. And then there's also support that makes this engagement easier, and then friction, which are things that makes this engagement harder. And so every time that anybody actually is working in research, they're balancing all these things, at least internally. Okay, so open science then, we can think of in a bunch of different ways, and I'm just going to introduce this without going into detail because I'm not completely sure of the right way to actually to map all of these concepts yet. But we have different terms of open access, open data, open source, open governance, open use. And we have different meanings of openness as well, of things being open to read, open to use or to run, open to build, open to change, and then open to work or to collaborate in some ways. And we also have a variety of different kinds of items that we can apply this to, of papers, of elements of papers, of notebooks, data, software, machine learning models, protocols and methods, research plans, data management plans or software management plans, and studies and standards. And I think that there hasn't really been enough work to actually map these ideas and to come up with a framework where we can say, what does open science mean for software? What are the things that we're actually concerned about? What are the items? What are the meanings? What are the terms that we want to use? So I think this is something that'll be interesting to see how this develops over time. So let me jump to fair data for a second. The fair data came from this idea of a scientific commons, I think, and it came out of the open access movement that really started, again, I think in 2001 with the Budapest Open Access Initiative. The fair data movement started in 2014 in a Leiden workshop, and it was built to change practices in general from closed to open, although not entirely. It was based on the current practices of publishing, which were often closed at that time and kind of often are still closed, and the lack of data sharing associated with that publishing that made it hard to understand work and to reproduce work. And it also focused on the use of data repositories. So the fair data work has no requirement for openness. Again, it pushes for openness, but it doesn't require it. And it's very pragmatic in a lot of ways to live with the existing infrastructure, the existing ecosystem, and to try to push things in a good direction, but not to make drastic changes. So the FAIR principles, I'm just going to say very briefly, are a set of principles to ensure that data are shared in a way that enables and enhances reuse by humans and machines. There's a set of principles that make data and metadata specifically findable, that make the data and metadata accessible, that make data and metadata interoperable, and that make data and metadata reusable. And I'll just point out that there's a set of these principles, and they're written in a way that makes them fairly general, but also somewhat hard to actually follow in practice. This is not a checklist that says, do this and your data will be fair. It's a set of principles that are a set of goals that you want to work towards over time. Okay, so this is fair for data. These FAIR principles in the paper originally written about this say that this is intended to apply to all research objects, both those used in research and those that are research outputs. The text in the principles, as you saw, often includes this phrase metadata with meta in parentheses, which is shorthand for metadata and data. And the principles are actually applied via dataset creators and via data repositories. And collectively, these are responsible for creating, annotating, indexing, preserving, and sharing the data sets and their metadata. And this assumes that there are separate and sequential creator and publisher or repository roles. Right? Somebody creates the data, it's given to somebody else, and they put it in a repository. They store it, they archive it, they make it available, they make it searchable. If we think about non-data objects, they can be stored as data, but they're not just data. And these high-level goals of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable are generally the same for different kinds of objects, but the details of them and how they're actually implemented depend on how the objects are created and used, how and where the objects are stored and shared, and how and where metadata is stored and indexed for these objects. And so there's work that's needed to define and implement and adopt principles for other kinds of objects other than data. If we think about the need for FAIR for non-data objects, again, the FAIR principles were intended to apply to all digital objects. The FAIR Practice Task Force within EOSC in 2020 came up with a set of recommendations for implementation of FAIR practice, and recommendation 5 is to recognize that FAIR guidelines will require translation for other digital objects, and that EOSC should support such efforts. So I think this is something that's kind of generally accepted. It's been worked on in a few different areas for training materials, how to make those FAIR for computational workflows, for machine learning models, and for virtual research environments, or science gateways as they're sometimes called. So if we think about kind of software now, and software versus data, we have, again, the fact that software is data, but it's not just data. Software is executable, while data is not. Data provides evidence, while software provides a tool. Software is a creative work, and scientific data are facts and observations. And again, going back to the previous talk, this leads to different licensing and different copyright practices around software versus data. Software suffers from a different kind of bit rot than data. And this is because it's almost always built to use other software, leading to complex dependencies. And these dependent software packages also frequently change. Sorry about the typo there. And the lifetime of software is generally not as long as that of data, although this is a generalization. And the last thing is that for open source in particular, there's no natural sequential creator and then publisher process. And there's no natural publisher. There's no real idea of a kind of archival repository in which software is used and is found. GitHub or GitLab, for example, are not archival repositories. They're more social platforms for collaborative code development. So again, going back to this kind of open science idea, we have work done in free software. And initially, there were two freedoms, I guess, for free software. The freedom to copy a program and redistribute it, and then the freedom to change a program so you can control it. And currently, this has gone to really four freedoms: the freedom to run the program, the freedom to study the program and change it, the freedom to redistribute copies, and the freedom to distribute copies to others. So this is kind of again, within the open science world, the open software world, there are overlaps here, but these things are not exactly the same. Kind of recognizing this and trying to work from this, we have a group on FAIR for research software that started to interpret the FAIR principles for research software in the context of trying to make science open, and in the context of open source as one of the main pieces. So this working group is defining FAIR principles for research software. There are 9 of us that are co-leaders of it, and it's been done under 3 different organizations: Force 11, RDA, and RISA, the Research Software Alliance, all co-organizing this activity. We started off with a bunch of subgroups, one of which just took a look at the FAIR principles for data and tried to figure out how do we apply that to research software, not based on any previous work. We published a preprint on this. Another group looked at the FAIR work in other contexts, and again, I mentioned a number of those previously, and tried to see, can we learn from those what we can do with software. A third group actually tried to define research software. So if we're doing FAIR principles for research software, what does that actually mean? And then a fourth group is looking at new research. There was a paper in 2019 that started looking at this idea. And so this fourth group kind of looked at what happened after that paper and how did people use it and what can we learn from that. Okay, so the working group had a bunch of webinars and talks and did an initial analysis of all these subgroup works, and this led to a set of questions. The questions then were asked to the large full working group for input, and we published that information. We then held a bunch of writing sprints and assembled a draft from the subgroup products and the initial community input. And then we went back to the full working group and had a review of that draft, and then had an official community review, a public review outside of the working group as part of the RDA process of a second draft. And we have now just about finished drafting the final version 1 FAIR principles for research software that will be published via RDA and through a journal. So one of the pieces, again, is defining research software. This includes the idea conceptually that software can be a project or an entity or a community or a software idea, and a software artifact can be source code or binaries or executables or containers. Software actually fits into different parts of the research process as well. It can be a tool to enable the research process. It can be a research outcome or a result, or it can be the object of the research. For example, if you're studying open source software. So we defined research software as including the source code files, algorithms, scripts, computational workflows, and executables that were created during the research process or for a research purpose, and recognize that there are also other software components, things like operating systems, for example, that are used for research but not created during or with the research intent, and that we would consider these software in research but not research software. The difference between these two different categories varies between disciplines, right? We may have one answer in computer science and another answer in computational linguistics or computational chemistry, for example. So the FAIR principles for research software, then we have version 0 point something or other that is available. We don't have version 1 publicly available yet. The concepts won't change from the current version to the first published version, but some language will. If you're interested, you can cite this and you can download it. It has a DOI currently, and in version 1, we know the DOI that we'll have, but it's not available yet. And so just to kind of step through these briefly, we have principles for findability that, sorry, just checking time for a second. So principles for findability that are basically very similar to the principles for data. We have principles for accessibility that, again, are pretty similar to the principles for data. We have principles for interoperability that are actually quite different than the principles for data. And so I'll just mention here that we actually had to figure out how to define interoperability for software versus interoperability for data. And what we chose to do was to define the interoperability means how software interoperates with other software. And it's through the data or metadata or APIs that it uses to do such an exchange. And these are described through standards. And then finally, reusability is also quite different for software and for data because the software first has to be usable, that it can be executed, which is not necessarily straightforward if you have source code. And it also then needs to be reusable, that it can be understood and modified and built upon and incorporated into other software. And so if I just kind of try to summarize this a little bit, the original FAIR principles mixed metadata and data far too strongly. They were really written to assume that everything was going to be data, even though they said that they were more general. And so a lot of the metadata part translates directly to metadata about software, but the data part doesn't, right? Data and software are not the same thing, and how we consider them, how we treat them, it really needs to be different. Again, as I said, the FAIR, findable, and accessible parts basically don't change, but some gaps start to appear. And the interoperable and reusable part, there's multiple possible definitions that need to be resolved. We made a particular set of choices. Somebody else may have made different choices. And the gaps then that appear, you can think of as either gaps in the ecosystem or open questions, but they're particularly related to metadata and archiving and versioning. And again, we have the fact that this creator and publisher sequence doesn't typically apply in software. We have questions about where metadata is stored, which could be in the code repository for open source, but for closed source, we have no idea. It could be in the archival repository, it could be in a registry. We don't know really where code is archived. Again, GitHub and GitLab are not archival. Registries are not archival, data repositories are, so should we put our software in data repositories? Should we use software heritage for this? Should we think about things like PyPy and CRAN and Python and R as repositories, which they kind of are, but aren't exactly like packaging systems? And then we have different use cases for software that require using a specific version or using the latest version or using all versions. And so these different versions may or may not all be in the repository, which also leads to challenges. So currently where we are is that we've formed subgroups on adoption and future governance, and these groups are basically close to done at this point. We're developing adoption guidelines and instructions intending to pick up checklists and kind of how-tos to make research software fair. In terms of adoption support, we're identifying early adopters and sharing their lessons and results. And you can see this is kind of a mix of societies, funding organizations, particular projects, particular institutions mostly in North America and in Europe, which is maybe a failing that we're not taking enough of a global view here. But these are the organizations that have been willing to start doing work, and hopefully that we can learn from. And then also we need to worry about governance. So one of the issues with the FAIR data principles is once they were published, it's not exactly clear what happens, who decides how to interpret them, who decides how to measure them. And so we're trying to address that in FAIR for research software to to say how we interpret the principles, and if we need to make changes, how we actually would do that in the future. In the future, other things that we'll need to do is to work on metrics to measure the fairness of specific research software, to measure the adoption of fair for research software in an organization, and to measure the fairness of the set of all research software in general to understand how we're doing. We also need to think about incentives and policies, and use the lessons from these early adopters to consider changes in culture that we want, and think about how to actually implement those changes in the policies of research institutions and publishers and funders and repositories and societies and individual researchers. There's also things that are missing at this point, and they're missing from FAIR in general, and they're missing potentially from FAIR for research software as well. So one of them is replicable evaluation. There are different tools that measure the fairness of data right now, and those tools can give different answers to the same data, and it's very unclear which tool you should use and how much any of these tools should be trusted. There's questions about correctness and quality. Right? FAIR doesn't say anything about correctness. It doesn't say anything about quality. You can have software that doesn't work and is very poorly written, and it can be 100% fair. So there's things beyond FAIR as well. FAIR doesn't really say anything about credit or attribution either. So even though it puts things into repositories and talks about metadata, it doesn't actually encourage sharing from the point of view of the author in some sense, unless there's just a mandate that says, all right, you must make this fair. There's no kind of built-in incentive for an author to want to do this because there's no requirement within FAIR to provide credit or attribution for work that you're using. Openness is not a requirement of FAIR. Should it be? I don't know. Again, the FAIR work is done in a pragmatic way with this idea that some things can't be open and we also want them to be fair. For example, data about human subjects, potentially software related to national security or commercial interests. So somehow this has to be balanced with this idea of sharing and reusability, and it's not really clear how to do that. There's also an issue about sharing via license versus sharing via community and governance. So you can write software and you can put it on GitHub and give it an open source license, and you can say that that's being shared and that's technically true. Or you can develop it over time on GitHub and involve a community and find collaborators and bring those collaborators into the governance. And that's probably a more powerful and more open sharing that's probably better. But from the point of view of FAIR, these are equal. And then kind of tied to that is this idea of open development and not just sharing at the end, which is in some sense the same thing or a very similar thing. So with that, just to wrap up, I think that that open science and open source have a curiously interwoven history, but both of them seem to be moving forward in parallel with each other. The FAIR data principles really set out a good goal to ensure that data are shared in a way that enables and enhances reuse by humans and machines. But there's work that's needed to apply this goal to research software, both to open source and non-open source. And hopefully this will help drive us towards open science concepts. We have principles that have been created for FAIR for research software. About 500 people have been involved in about 60 events up to this point. And there's a draft of that available. It's interesting and useful that open science and open software and FAIR for research software are all really open communities, and they have significant overlap. So we do learn from each other through people moving from one to another and interacting that way. And we are now finalizing, and we'll publish version 1 of these principles again with a DOI that's available, even though there's nothing there yet. And we have work underway to create guidance and help to adopt these principles and to define governance for them. And then the next steps, as I said, will be to create metrics and to widen adoption. So that's basically where things are in FAIR for research software and how this, I think, overlaps with open science and the goals of open science. And again, I'm pretty positive about where things are. So hopefully, if there are questions, I can try to answer them. And if not, we'll have the speaker thing coming up next. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, truly a fascinating discussion. We do have some questions. I'm going to make the recommendation, since the other speakers are coming in at 3:15 also in about 6 minutes, that maybe if people would like to ask Professor Katz directly some questions, we'll move it over to the speaker corner. But real quick, if we can, maybe just one quick question here. How do you see the relation connection of the work you presented to the activities around EOSC, European Open Science Cloud?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and I think I have I don't know, being in North America, I have the benefit of looking at EOSC from a distance and trying to see what it's doing, but I also have the failing that it's fairly hard to interpret everything that EOSC is doing, and in some ways I see it as kind of like open science in some ways, a term that's used for a lot of different things that hopefully that all have positive intents, but that in terms of the implementation are a little bit unclear, and how different working groups, how these different themes, how these different practitioners are all going to come together to deliver this actually very positive vision, and how much of it actually can be achieved, and I don't really know the answer to that. So I guess what I would say is that there's a lot of overlap between people, again, people that are defining EOSC, people that are working on different parts of EOSC, and so I think that there's a lot of the concepts from FAIR for research software will be implemented kind of through that exchange of people process. I don't know if there will be something more formal or not, but I know that EOSC is supportive of the idea of FAIR and the idea of FAIR for research software. So I'm hopeful that things will kind of come together through an informal process of people with similar goals.
Super, thank you very much. As I said, we're running a little bit short on time. So what I would suggest is that in a few minutes, we come back to the speaker's corner. For the remaining of those questions, you can ask that directly to Professor Katz. First of all, I'd like to, as we do to all of our speakers, virtually thank you. Daniel, thank you very much for a very interesting and thought-provoking talk.